Welcome to a story that will tug at your heartstrings and keep you on the edge of your seat. Today, we delve into the life of Margaret Weston, an elderly woman whose golden years were not filled with the love and care she deserved. Instead, she found herself abandoned by the very family she once nurtured. But as they say, what goes around comes around. What happens when the time comes for the final will to be read? Will it be a simple transfer of wealth, or will it expose deeper, darker truths that could change everything? Stay with us as we unravel a tale of family, betrayal, and the shocking twist that no one saw coming. You won't want to miss a moment. The story begins now. Margaret sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the empty parking lot outside the Golden Meadows nursing home. It had been weeks since her last visitor, and today was supposed to be different. Sarah had promised to come by after her business trip, but as the minutes turned into hours, Margaret knew better than to get her hopes up. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, and Margaret's heart sank with it. Another broken promise. She reached for the phone on the bedside table, her frail hand trembling slightly as she dialed Michael's number. The line rang twice before he picked up. "Hey, Mom," he answered, his voice distant. "I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" Margaret forced a smile, though there was no one to see it. "Sure, Michael. Take care," she replied softly. The line went dead, and Margaret placed the phone back, her fingers lingering on it for a moment longer. Later that evening, when the corridors were quiet and the nurses had settled in for the night, Emily slipped into the room. The teenager's presence was like a breath of fresh air in the stale environment. "Grandma, I brought you something," Emily whispered, pulling out a small photo album from her bag. They spent the next hour flipping through the pages, sharing memories that only they seemed to cherish. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Emily knew she had to leave. "I'll come back soon, I promise," she said, squeezing Margaret's hand before sneaking out the way she came. Alone again, Margaret sat in the dim light, her thoughts drifting to the past. She remembered the laughter that once filled her home, the joy of watching her children grow. But those days were long gone, replaced by a silence that echoed louder than any noise. She was a mother forgotten, left behind like an old relic. And yet, she wasn't ready to fade away without making her final mark. Margaret closed her eyes, a plan beginning to form in the back of her mind. She had one last card to play, and she would make sure it counted. The next morning, Margaret was greeted by a knock on the door. It was Mr. Turner, her longtime lawyer and trusted confidant. His presence in the nursing home wasn't a regular occurrence, but Margaret had requested this visit with urgency. Mr. Turner entered the small room with a briefcase in hand, his expression somber yet respectful. "Good morning, Margaret. You wanted to see me." Margaret nodded, her eyes sharp with resolve. "Yes, Henry. It's time we make some changes to my will." Mr. Turner sat down at the small table by the window, setting his briefcase beside him. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently, knowing the weight of her decision. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "I've never been more certain." As Mr. Turner began taking notes, Margaret's thoughts wandered to the moments that had led her here. She recalled the countless times she had been pushed aside, ignored, or used by her own children. Sarah's cold indifference, Michael's incessant requests for money, each memory stung like a fresh wound. But instead of breaking her spirit, they had only steeled her determination. When the conversation turned to her assets, Mr. Turner was taken aback by the full extent of Margaret's wealth. "I had no idea you had amassed such a fortune," he admitted. Margaret offered a faint smile. "Neither did my children. But they won't see a penny of it unless they start to understand what truly matters." The lawyer nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. Together, they worked through the details, ensuring that Margaret's wishes would be honored to the letter. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Emily returned for her usual visit. Margaret was unusually quiet, her mind heavy with the decisions she had made. After some coaxing, Margaret shared her secret with Emily, who listened in stunned silence. "You can't tell anyone, Emily. Not until the time is right," Margaret implored. Emily, though shocked, agreed, knowing how important this was to her grandmother. By the time Mr. Turner left, the will was sealed, and with it, Margaret's last stand against the family that had abandoned her. She felt a strange sense of peace wash over her, as if a burden had been lifted. The plan was set, and all that was left was to wait. Days passed, and the air grew colder as winter approached. Sarah finally decided to visit her mother, more out of guilt than genuine concern. She arrived at Golden Meadows wearing a designer coat, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. The nurses greeted her with polite smiles, but Sarah barely acknowledged them. She was here to check a box, to reassure herself that she was doing her duty as a daughter. Margaret looked up from her chair as Sarah entered the room. There was an awkward silence as the two women faced each other. "Mother," Sarah began, her voice devoid of warmth, "how are you feeling?" Margaret could see through the thin veneer of concern, but she didn't have the energy to challenge it. "I'm managing," she replied softly, her eyes searching Sarah's face for any sign of the daughter she once knew. The conversation was stilted and short-lived. Sarah talked about her work, her social engagements, all the while avoiding any real connection. She stayed for less than an hour before excusing herself, citing a meeting she couldn't miss. As she left, Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest, an ache that came from knowing that her daughter was already a world away, both in distance and in heart. Meanwhile, Michael was dealing with his own struggles. His finances were in disarray, and desperation was creeping in. He needed money, and quickly. One afternoon, he called Margaret, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe we could get together sometime? I could use a bit of advice on a business deal I'm working on." Margaret knew what was coming next. She had heard this plea too many times before. "I don't have anything to give you, Michael," she said firmly. "You need to stand on your own feet." Michael's tone changed in an instant. The warmth vanished, replaced by irritation. "Right. Well, I'll figure something out," he muttered before abruptly ending the call. Margaret hung up the phone, her heart heavy with disappointment. She knew Michael's struggles, but she also knew that helping him now would only prolong the inevitable. He needed to learn, even if it broke her heart to watch him fail. Emily, aware of the tension in the family, found herself in a difficult position. She loved her grandmother dearly and wanted to support her, but the burden of keeping Margaret's secret was growing heavier by the day. Every time she saw her parents, she felt the weight of the unspoken words between them. She longed to bridge the gap, to somehow bring her family back together, but she was just one girl against a tide of resentment and misunderstanding. As the days dragged on, Sarah and Michael remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. They continued with their lives, confident that everything was under control. But Margaret knew better. She could see the cracks in the facade, and she knew that soon, everything would come crashing down. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. She knew something was wrong even before the first cough racked her frail body. The nurses at Golden Meadows moved quickly, calling for an ambulance as Margaret's breathing became labored. Within hours, she was admitted to the hospital, her condition critical. The news spread quickly to Sarah and Michael, who hurried to the hospital, fear gnawing at the edges of their minds. Sarah arrived first, her composed exterior barely hiding the turmoil within. She paced the sterile hallway outside Margaret's room, glancing at her phone every few minutes, as if willing it to bring good news. Michael joined her soon after, his face drawn with worry and guilt. They exchanged a brief, tense greeting, both too consumed by their own thoughts to offer comfort to the other. Inside the room, Margaret lay still, her breathing shallow and irregular. The beeping of the machines filled the silence, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Emily was the last to arrive, slipping quietly into the room. She stood by her grandmother's side, holding her hand, the tears she had held back finally spilling over. Margaret stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she sensed Emily's presence. "My sweet girl," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with affection. Emily leaned in closer, struggling to hold back her sobs. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm right here." Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at her granddaughter, the one person who had never abandoned her. "Don't cry, Emily. I'm at peace with what's coming." As the day wore on, Sarah and Michael took turns sitting by Margaret's side, though their conversations were brief and stilted. The siblings spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the deeper emotions that lingered just beneath the surface. Neither of them knew what to say, how to bridge the distance that had grown between them and their mother. Margaret, sensing that her time was running out, mustered the strength for one final conversation. She motioned for Emily to bring Sarah and Michael into the room. As they stood by her bed, Margaret looked at each of them in turn, her eyes filled with a sadness that words couldn't capture. "I wish things had been different," she began, her voice barely audible. "But I need you to know that I loved you both. In my own way." Sarah and Michael exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. They both nodded, each lost in their own thoughts, as the weight of unspoken words hung heavily in the room. Margaret closed her eyes, her strength fading. "Take care of each other," she murmured, her final request hanging in the air. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the family that had so often taken her for granted. The hospital room, once filled with tension, now held only grief and regret. Sarah and Michael were left to grapple with the reality of their mother's death, each carrying the burden of the choices they had made. But the storm was far from over. The reading of the will was just days away, and with it, a truth that would shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the family. The day of Margaret's funeral was cold and overcast, with dark clouds hanging low in the sky. The small church where the service was held was filled with distant relatives, old friends, and a few of Margaret's former neighbors. Sarah and Michael, standing side by side at the front, were the picture of composure, though beneath their stoic expressions, their thoughts were elsewhere, on the will and what it might contain. As the service began, Emily stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word a tribute to the woman who had meant so much to her. "My grandmother was more than just a relative. She was my friend, my confidant, and my guide. She taught me that love isn't just about being there in the good times, but about standing by each other even when it's hard. I will miss her more than words can say." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she returned to her seat, her heart heavy with both grief and anticipation. She knew what was coming. She knew the shock that awaited her parents when the will was read. But even she wasn't fully prepared for the impact it would have. After the service, the family gathered in the living room of Sarah's grand home. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as Mr. Turner arrived, carrying the sealed envelope that contained Margaret's final wishes. Sarah and Michael sat on the edge of their seats, their minds racing with possibilities. Mr. Turner began by expressing his condolences, his tone grave and respectful. Then, he opened the envelope, his hand steady as he unfolded the document. "Margaret Weston's last will and testament," he announced, his voice clear. The room fell silent, every eye on him, every breath held. As Mr. Turner read the contents of the will, the initial expressions of expectation on Sarah and Michael's faces turned to disbelief. Margaret had left the bulk of her estate, not to her children, but to Emily. The house, the savings, even the valuable collection of antiques. Everything was to go to her granddaughter. Sarah and Michael were each left with a small, symbolic sum, barely enough to cover a few months' expenses. The room erupted in chaos. Sarah jumped to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "This can't be right. I'm her daughter. I was supposed to inherit everything," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. Michael, equally shocked, slumped back in his chair, his mind reeling. "Why would she do this?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Emily sat frozen, her heart pounding. She had known about the will, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. She looked at her parents, their faces twisted in anger and confusion, and felt a pang of guilt. But she also understood why Margaret had done it. This was her final stand, her last attempt to make them see what truly mattered. Mr. Turner remained calm in the face of the outburst. "I understand this is difficult to accept, but these were Margaret's wishes. She believed this was the best way to ensure her legacy would be honored." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Sarah and Michael were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions, or inactions. Emily, now the unexpected heir, felt the weight of her grandmother's trust and love, along with the responsibility it carried. But the true impact of Margaret's decision was just beginning to unfold. The will had done more than distribute wealth. It had set the stage for a reckoning that would force each of them to confront the choices they had made and the relationships they had neglected. The shock of Margaret's will reverberated through the Weston family like an earthquake, shattering the foundations of their already fragile relationships. In the days that followed the reading, the tension between Sarah and Michael escalated into outright hostility. They had both assumed they would inherit everything, and now, with their expectations crushed, they turned on each other. Sarah was the first to lash out. She stormed into Michael's apartment, her eyes blazing with fury. "You knew about this, didn't you?" she accused, her voice sharp. Michael looked up from the disarray of unpaid bills scattered across his kitchen table, his face etched with frustration. "What are you talking about?" he shot back, his tone defensive. "The will," Sarah snapped. "You must have known something was up. Why else would she leave everything to Emily? You've been scheming, haven't you?" Michael's anger flared. "You're out of your mind, Sarah. I had no idea about any of this. And if you're looking for someone to blame, maybe you should start with yourself. You were the one who was always too busy to visit Mom. Don't pretend like you cared." The argument escalated, voices rising, each sibling hurling accusations that had been simmering for years. They blamed each other for everything, for their mother's loneliness, for their own failures, for the unexpected twist of fate that had left them both with so little. But beneath the surface, they both knew the truth. They were as much to blame as each other. Meanwhile, Emily was grappling with the overwhelming responsibility that had been thrust upon her. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a testament to her grandmother's love and trust, something she couldn't take lightly. But with it came guilt, a nagging feeling that she didn't deserve this, especially when she saw how it had torn her family apart. Mr. Turner tried to mediate, explaining that Margaret's decision was final and legally binding. He urged Sarah and Michael to accept their mother's wishes, to move forward without further conflict. But Sarah wasn't ready to let it go. "We need to contest this," she declared, her eyes narrowed in determination. There's no way she was in her right mind when she made that will. Michael hesitated, torn between his own resentment and the realization that contesting the will would likely lead to a lengthy, costly legal battle, a battle he couldn't afford. But Sarah's determination was unshakable. She contacted lawyers, gathering whatever she could to support her claim. Michael, though less certain, followed her lead, driven more by desperation than conviction. As the siblings prepared to challenge the will, Emily was left to navigate her own conflicted feelings. She met with Mr. Turner privately, seeking his advice. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice wavering. "I don't want to be the reason my family falls apart." Mr. Turner looked at her kindly, his gaze steady. "Emily, your grandmother trusted you to do what's right. You need to decide how to honor her memory in a way that feels true to who you are. But remember, Margaret wanted this for you, for a reason." Emily nodded, her mind racing. She knew she had to make a decision, one that would either heal the rift in her family or deepen it. But what was the right choice? And could she bear the consequences of whatever path she chose? As the days passed, the tension within the Weston family reached a breaking point. The lawsuit loomed on the horizon, threatening to tear apart what little remained of their familial bond. And as Emily stood at the crossroads, she knew that whatever decision she made would change everything. Forever. As the legal battle over the will began to take shape, Sarah and Michael found themselves ensnared in a web of stress and bitterness. The once small cracks in their relationship had widened into chasms, with every conversation turning into an argument. Lawyers were consulted, strategies were planned, and money was spent. Money neither of them could truly afford to waste. Emily, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated. The strain of the situation weighed heavily on her young shoulders, and she struggled with the guilt of being the beneficiary of her grandmother's will. The trust Margaret had placed in her felt like a burden, one that grew heavier with each passing day. She had avoided speaking with her parents since the reading of the will, afraid of how they might react to her presence. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion with her lawyer, Sarah returned home to find Emily sitting in the living room, waiting for her. The sight of her daughter sitting there, looking so small and uncertain, softened something in Sarah's heart. But the anger and frustration she felt overshadowed any tenderness. "Mom," Emily began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about the will." Sarah's expression hardened. "What about it? Are you here to rub it in?" Emily flinched at the harshness in her mother's voice. "No, I don't want this to tear us apart. Grandma wouldn't have wanted that either." Sarah sighed, the weight of everything finally catching up to her. She sank into a chair opposite Emily, rubbing her temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "Then why did she do it? Why did she leave everything to you?" Emily looked down at her hands, unsure of how to explain what she felt. "I think she wanted to teach us all something. That money isn't what matters most. But I don't want it if it means losing you and Dad." Sarah's gaze softened slightly as she heard the sincerity in her daughter's voice. For the first time since the will was read, she saw how much this was affecting Emily. She realized, perhaps too late, that Margaret's decision had put Emily in an impossible position. At the same time, across town, Michael was sitting in his own small apartment, surrounded by reminders of his financial struggles. Bills piled up on the table, and the stress of the lawsuit weighed on him like a ton of bricks. He was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, financially. As he stared at the papers in front of him, a wave of regret washed over him. He had let his greed and desperation blind him to what really mattered. He had always seen his mother as a source of financial support, never stopping to consider the toll it had taken on their relationship. And now, it was too late to make amends. The next day, Michael reached out to Emily. They met at a small cafe, the tension between them palpable. But instead of the animosity Emily expected, Michael seemed different, defeated perhaps, but also reflective. "Emily," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. This whole mess. It's not worth it. Mom didn't raise us to fight over money. She always wanted us to take care of each other." Emily nodded, feeling a surge of hope. "I agree. We can still fix this, Uncle Michael. We don't have to let it destroy us." For the first time since the reading of the will, Michael smiled, just a small, sad smile, but it was genuine. "You're right. Maybe we can find a way to honor Mom's memory without all this fighting." As the lawsuit loomed, Sarah, Michael, and Emily found themselves at a crossroads. The choices they made in the days ahead would determine whether the family could heal, or whether the rift would become permanent. But for the first time since Margaret's death, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption. In the days leading up to the court hearing, Sarah found herself restless, unable to shake the feeling that she was making a mistake. She had always prided herself on her ability to make rational decisions, but now her heart and mind were at war. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that contesting the will wasn't just about the money. It was about her unresolved guilt and regret. One morning, as she sat in her office, staring blankly at the paperwork for the lawsuit, a memory surfaced, a memory of her mother years ago, comforting her after a particularly bad day at work. Margaret had told her that family was the only thing that truly mattered, that no amount of success or wealth could replace the love and support of those closest to you. The memory struck a chord deep within Sarah, and she felt the first stirrings of doubt about the path she had chosen. Michael, too, was grappling with his own realizations. The conversation with Emily had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He had spent so many years resenting his mother for not giving him more, but now he saw things differently. Margaret hadn't owed him anything. If anything, he owed her for all the time she had bailed him out. The bitterness that had fueled his actions began to ebb, replaced by a sense of shame and a desire to make things right. Emily, on the other hand, was determined to use her inheritance in a way that would honor her grandmother's memory. She knew that Margaret had wanted to teach the family a lesson, and Emily was starting to understand what that lesson was. It wasn't about the money. It was about finding a way to bring the family back together, to heal the wounds that had festered for so long. With these thoughts in mind, Emily called a family meeting. It was an uneasy gathering, with Sarah and Michael both tense and uncertain. But as Emily began to speak, her voice steady and filled with conviction, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. "I've been thinking a lot about what Grandma would have wanted," Emily said, looking from her mother to her uncle. "She didn't leave me everything to cause a rift between us. I think she wanted us to learn something, to understand that love and family are more important than money." Sarah's eyes softened as she listened to her daughter's words. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she hadn't considered what she still had, a family, fractured but not beyond repair. Michael, too, felt a pang of remorse as he looked at Emily. She was right. They had lost sight of what really mattered. "I don't want this money if it means losing both of you," Emily continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm willing to share the inheritance, but only if we agree to stop this fighting and start rebuilding our relationships." There was a long silence as Sarah and Michael absorbed what Emily was offering. The money no longer seemed as important as the chance to mend the broken bonds between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "You're right, Emily. I've let my anger and resentment blind me to what's really important. I'm willing to drop the lawsuit, if we can find a way to move forward together." Michael nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I agree. Mom wouldn't have wanted us to tear each other apart over this. Let's make things right." For the first time in months, there was a sense of hope in the air. The family was far from perfect, and the road to reconciliation would be long and difficult. But they were willing to try, to honor Margaret's memory by rebuilding the relationships they had neglected for so long. And as they made this pact, a new beginning took shape, one built not on the foundation of wealth, but on the enduring strength of family. Several weeks had passed since the family meeting, and the Weston family was slowly beginning to mend. The lawsuit was dropped, and while the wounds of the past were still healing, there was a new sense of unity among them. They had started meeting regularly, sometimes for dinner, other times just to talk, and the conversations, once tense and guarded, had grown more open and heartfelt. One afternoon, while sorting through some of Margaret's belongings that had been left in storage, Emily discovered a small, old-fashioned wooden box. Inside, she found a letter addressed to her. The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's, and Emily's heart skipped a beat as she unfolded the paper. The letter began simply, "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and the decisions I made have come to light. I know it must have been difficult for you to be put in the position I left you in, but I want you to understand why I did it." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she read her grandmother's words. The letter was a mix of personal reflections and advice, each sentence filled with love and wisdom. Margaret explained that she had seen the growing distance in the family and had felt powerless to stop it. She had hoped that by leaving the inheritance to Emily, she could provoke a change, force the family to reevaluate what truly mattered. "Money can be a blessing or a curse," Margaret had written. "I didn't want my legacy to be the source of division, but rather a catalyst for reconciliation. I believe in you, Emily. You have the strength and wisdom to use this gift in a way that honors the love and values that our family once held dear." As Emily finished reading, she felt a deep sense of peace. The letter was more than just a message from beyond the grave. It was the final gift her grandmother had left her, a gift of understanding, of purpose, and of love. With renewed resolve, Emily shared the letter with her mother and uncle at their next family dinner. The words had a profound effect on both Sarah and Michael. They realized that Margaret had been trying to protect them in her own way, even after her death, by forcing them to confront their own flaws and failures. Tears were shed, apologies were exchanged, and slowly, the family began to rebuild on this newfound foundation. Emily decided to use part of the inheritance to set up a charitable foundation in Margaret's name, dedicated to supporting elderly individuals who, like her grandmother, had been forgotten or neglected by their families. It was a way to ensure that Margaret's legacy would continue to make a difference in the lives of others, even after her passing. As the months turned into years, the Weston family grew closer than they had been in a long time. The scars of the past didn't disappear, but they served as reminders of the lessons they had learned, the importance of family, the dangers of letting material wealth overshadow love, and the power of forgiveness. Margaret's final gift wasn't just the money she had left behind. It was the realization that family, no matter how fractured, could find its way back to each other. And as they gathered to celebrate what would have been Margaret's 80th birthday, there was laughter and warmth in the room, a testament to the enduring strength of the ties that bound them together. Margaret's legacy lived on, not just in the charitable foundation, but in the hearts of the family she had brought back from the brink. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.